This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
Over 25 years helping leaders reducing errors and incidents. Here is your host of the Essential Leadership Cycle podcast, Rob Fisher.
Welcome to episode 3 of the Essential Leadership Cycle podcast. I'm your host and intentional leader, Rob Fisher. On the last episode, we described the first attribute of the Essential Leadership Cycle, self and team awareness. Hope listeners immediately use some of the recommendations at the end of the podcast to start making changes in their intentional leadership. By now, you should have downloaded the eColors app, taken the personality diversity indicator, and discovered a little bit about your personality and the personalities of those people around you, some of your strengths, some of your potential limiters, and had those discussions. In this episode, I'm going to discuss the second attribute of the cycle, shared vision and values. Did you know that 2 of the 4 major personality groups typically believe that if I give you something, it's shared? In other words, we put the vision and values out. If you work here, you agree. Therefore, we have a shared vision and set of values. But did you also know that 2 of the 4 major personality groups believe that if something isn't shared, unless they've actually truly bought into both the value and the behaviors behind the values? They don't believe that it's shared unless they have an element of internal buy-in. And you don't know that they have that unless you verify it. Do you know of a leader or an organization that's been surprised by a safety culture or an engagement survey, that the outcome wasn't what they expected? This surprise typically indicates a lack of self and team awareness and a limited shared vision and values. I was with an organization recently that claimed they weren't surprised by their poor employee responses to a recent survey. The question would then be, are we as leaders living the values to support our vision if we know there's a mismatch and we haven't done anything about it? Imagine a worker that works in an organization that has a value of innovation. And because the organization maybe has a stronger engineering background than work background, this element or value of innovation is talked about a lot. But the field workers are out in the field. They're doing things at risk. And what happens to this worker when they become innovative or creative in the way they solve a problem? And unless nothing bad happens, they're just following the value of innovation or creativity. But when something bad happens, they get yelled at for not following procedures. So which is it? Do you have a value of innovation or do you have a value of following procedures? And can you see that without explanation, without creative context, that the workforce could really get confused by the difference between a value of innovation or creativity and a requirement to follow very specific guidelines or procedures or processes? That would be an example of a mismatch in shared vision and values. What about the organization that has a value of safety first? And the leaders think that because they start every meeting with a safety moment, that they're living that value. But when you talk to the workforce, they tell you, yes, safety is first, right behind production and profit. Well, that's not a mismatch for the workforce. That's a mismatch in the way the leaders actually live the value of safety being first. What about the organization that strives for the vision of being most admired, and yet it has multiple environmental or OSHA violations? So you can see that a mismatch in the shared vision and values is important to how the work gets done in the organization. Remember when we talked in the last podcast about self and team awareness and how it can lead to a better shared vision and values. But it's up to the leaders to be constantly engaging to determine whether there is a match or some mismatches in the visions and values. They need to intentionally seek out this information in order to know where the team is at and what they need to do to change to ensure that the values mismatch doesn't lead to a major incident. Think about how every major incident that makes the news, when you boil it down, Somewhere in the organizational drivers of the incident was a team that was low on self and team awareness or was missing some shared vision and values. Values and mission and vision aren't necessarily shared because you put them on the website and on a bunch of posters. Senior leaders need to learn to verify that the managers understand what goes into the values, the whys. They need to verify C-suite and board understanding of why we have those values and what they really mean and what our behaviors around those values are. There's been a lot of talk lately around the zero movement. Things like zero harm, path to zero incidents, and a few others are thrown about in industry. And my experience is that when asked separately, no two people on a leadership team give the same answer to what is that? What does that mean? Or how do we do that? If the senior leaders and the managers don't understand it and cannot explain it well, you definitely do not have a shared vision of value in the workforce. Be careful. It's not the desire to do no harm that is the problem. It's the how leaders interpret what that means and their behaviors around it. If leaders understand that the vision is about not doing harm to the workforce and all of the things that go into reducing and mitigating risk, then they will probably manage no harm well, and they can convey it to the workforce. Unfortunately, because the number 0 is attached to things like zero harm, it just becomes another number that managers try to manage. This defeats the purpose of trying to identify the elements of our systems that could hurt, maim, or kill people, as we end up managing the indicator instead of the system, and the goal is unreachable. So many people disagree with the goal because it's unreachable, maybe permanently. But if you identify many systemic drivers, and some large companies have been known to significantly reduce harm in all forms for long periods by doing this, what would you rather the goal be? Some harm? A little harm? How do you explain to the people that will ultimately get harmed that those are okay? Consider the difference in an organizational value of our people are our greatest asset and a management directive for constant reinforcement of certain rules or constant reinforcement of the outcome of zero harm. Wouldn't a better management expectation of continual reinforcement be more aligned with that value? So here's what you can do. Go out and have some values-based engagements. Don't watch work. Have a conversation. Pick one of your values and design in advance some open-ended questions about how they interpret that value and what they think about your management behaviors do to show that value. Document your results and share them with your leadership team. Have other senior leaders and managers do the same. Then have a critical conversation among your leadership team about whether you have matches or unidentified mismatches in vision and values. Do we really share our vision and values, or do we just believe that since we've put them out, they have been shared? Next time on the Essential Leadership Cycle podcast, we will visit the next attribute of the cycle, clear roles and processes. This has been your host, Rob Fisher. Thanks for listening, and remember, intentional leadership starts with you.
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the host and its guest and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the company. Examples of analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based only on very limited and dated open source information. Assumptions made within this analysis are not reflective of the position of the company. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast, Jay Allen.